friends. Welcome to episode 7 of Tim's Travails with our host, Timothy Trainer, who is an award-winning author. In fact, Tim just won another award that you'll tell us about in a minute for your new book, The China Factor, behind me and also behind him. And he's an IP attorney and intellectual property attorney, so he brings a ton of insight into this podcast, which he usually interviews other attorneys. But today we are opening it up to our guest, Joe Relk. Welcome, Joe.
Thank
Joe
you.
is the has an amazing background, but what we're talking about mostly today is his book series, Sins of Our Saviors. It is a dystopian novel, two of them so far, which, today's topic is just sort of scarier than any of us would like, how fiction imitates reality. I'm Hope Katz-Gibbs, proud producer of the show on Incandescent Radio, Incandescent TV, and I'm going to throw it over to Tim to interview Joe Relk.
Well, thank you, Hope, and Joe. Welcome. Thanks for joining me here today. And just in thinking about what we are going to cover this during this podcast, I thought it might be helpful that we'll maybe give our viewers a little something about our respective backgrounds. And as we've spoken and had some exchanges prior to the podcast, we're both veterans, so we both have that little bit in common. So I'm just curious now. I was in the Army from 72 to 75, and prior to that, I grew up in an Army household. My father was career Army. But now, when were you serving active duty?
Oh, I came in, Tim, right out of high school
Okay, so did
in
I.
'88, and then I served through '92. And I don't know if you remember back in '92, they were actually offering people money to leave early.
Ah,
So I left 2 months early. I used the money to go to Egypt and Greece because I thought I would never again be offered the opportunity to travel outside of my home state of Idaho.
okay. Well, we know that you've traveled actually extensively, and again, to maybe to add to that, in addition to the military background, you have a civilian government career background that's pretty extensive, and you've traveled elsewhere, of course. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, after I came back home, I went to school. I then worked for the various media. I had a cable TV show. It was a little bit like Wayne's World, but about public affairs and current
Mhm.
events. I did radio for actually an NPR affiliate in Idaho, which was an interesting position to be in. And did print journalism as well for my hometown paper and for a little bit for the Spokesman Review from Spokane, Washington.
Mhm.
And then I did a few years with the Idaho Transportation Department working in their public affairs section. And then after about 4 years of that, I joined the State Department shortly after 9/11. And then I served more than 20 years in the State Department, mostly in Latin America, a couple tours in Afghanistan, one half a tour in Berlin,
Yeah.
and a few tours in DC. I've since then I have quote unquote retired in the Washington DC area. I've worked some temporary assignments for the State Department. I worked a speech writing position with National Geospatial
Hmm.
um, Agency, and then I had a contracting position with the State Department, which I stepped down from in February.
Well, what I'm hearing as you go through that is that you've had the opportunity to observe governments and the way things operate in a lot of different countries and compare them to how things occur or what occurs here in the United States from a governmental perspective, because being the State Department, you deal with counterparts in other governments and agencies of other governments in other states. So it gives you exposure to the way governments tend to work here, there, and everywhere. So I think it gives us an interesting platform to stand on and maybe talk about government generally and maybe more specifically government here in the United States these days, because probably it doesn't look exactly the way we would have envisioned at this particular point. It's a little strange to some of us, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, I would say from that foreign service perspective, I've seen a lot, and I've seen how governments do and do not do things abroad. The other sort of odd thing is, the overlap between some of the trends that are starting to unfold politically, and some of the writing in the books, the kind of near future thought experiment dystopian novel that I wrote. So I know we'll talk about that a little later, but I know we have also walked in the military boots, as it were. And you said you had also gone to FSI, is that correct?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's renamed FSI these days. It was DLI back in the day when I was there. So,
Oh, right. Defense language.
yeah,
Yeah, in Monterey. And I've
yeah.
gone to both Defense Language Institute in Monterey and the Foreign Service Institute here in this area.
Oh, well, see, you've got a little bit on me, but and of course I predate you by a few years as well, my time. And we were just well, we were coming out of Vietnam actually when I joined in 72. And you had the experience of you were serving during the first war, Iraq War, I guess 1991. So there are those kinds of parallels, if I guess we could say. But I think one of the things that interests me as well is the book that you're mentioning, Sins of the Saviors, that you've written, the prequel as well as the follow-up, looks at things in an interesting way, given that you seem to have been well, were you looking into a crystal ball when you wrote that?
So the main book, the draft, I should say, for the main book was originally written in 1991, and was just published a couple months ago. So I have been rather slow getting that out. I wrote it as a 20-year-old intelligence officer who was slated to go to Iraq. We didn't end up going there, but I did, do my research, and I was trying to figure out, how they got a hold of M109 artillery pieces and other U.S. armaments and that sort
Mhm.
of thing. So it sort of prompted a series of dreams that I had, and that became the draft for book one. And I didn't think about it then for 20 odd years. And then I found the draft in my mom's basement and I read it and I was like, this is, poorly written by a 20-year-old me, but the concept was more timely,
Yeah.
actually. And all the sort of trends that I had forecasted had festered and gotten a lot worse. So I decided to rewrite it from scratch in about 2017, 2018, and that's book one. So book one sort of takes us 50 years into the future after
Mhm.
events that lead to a dystopian future for many people. So it's about sort of how we get out of dystopia, which is a little bit of a uh, um, flipping the script on a lot of dystopian novels that are out there. The prequel was written more recently, more in 22, 23, before we knew who was going to be the presidential nominee, um, and who was going to win the election. So so I wanted to talk a little bit about how we got to dystopia,
Yeah.
because that was a criticism that some of my beta readers had, that you do get into in book two, which is finished and probably out next month. But I
Oh,
wanted
okay.
the readers of book one to experience it through the eyes of the protagonist, who is sent to a forever war he's not supposed to return to, and is basically in an information bubble for 50 years.
Very,
So he learns about some of the causes for the slide into authoritarianism and dystopia in book two. But some of my beta readers we'd like to know how we got there, right? So I
yeah.
did this prequel originally as a freebie,
Hmm.
and then people liked it and wanted it more fleshed out. So I turned it into a novella, and that went out last year. And that's what, I'll be talking mostly about that book, because the sort of slide into authoritarianism, the pretext for dystopia is all in that book.
So maybe you can touch on that just a little bit, given the current events here that we're actually living through, and where are the parallels from through that evolution, how you're going through that process. I mean, the sliding into is interesting given where we are and what the way things are today in real life.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go ahead and throw out sort of the basic premise without trying to give out too
Yeah.
much of the book. But I had envisioned a future in which um, people in the United States would get tired of polarization, would feel manipulated by the parties, would blame the parties for some existential crises that had been brewing and percolating up, and that would lead to, regardless of who won the last election, would open the door for like a an independent billionaire, happens to be a tech billionaire in my story, who takes advantage of that, has no political baggage, and sort of paints himself as the savior from all this politicized dysfunction.
Hmm.
And so he runs in 2028, and he can because he has the money, because, as we all know, not everyone can run for president, right? So he takes advantage of that. He casts himself as someone who will step down once he fixes some problems, and what he's really up to is a global conspiracy to basically elites determine that governments and democracies are not up to the tasks of these existential crises, like global warming, environmental degradation, resource scarcity, forever wars, AI, right?
Yeah.
They decide that it's not enough to try to manipulate the outcome. They want full control.
Yeah.
And so he's part of that, and how that unfolds is in the prequel. Um, and so I did get a lot. Again, this was all written ahead of the outcome of the last election. Some of the reviews I've gotten have discussed sort of the creepy parallels in the book with some of the things that are unfolding now. So I did not believe that we would need. I thought that we would need a war uh, to to mobilize this person to take over and institute authoritarianism, right? So that's a sort of nutshell description of the prequel, which is told from the protagonist's sister point of view. It's a first-person journal, which
Hmm.
opposed to the book,
Okay.
which is a
Yeah.
third-person narrative of the brother who is presumed dead in the Forever War and then comes back 50 years later.
Ah. And now you said you had I don't know if this goes into the passage you said you wanted to take a look at, and maybe it fits here or somewhere else. But as you were talking there, the one thing I was thinking is uh, the billionaire character, and you think of Elon Musk with all his hundreds of billions of dollars in his little Doge army, and you go, well, instead of doing good with all that money, you have to say, well, did they simply go in and take a lot of personal data with all that money in that army, and what are they going to do with it? And that's a real life, real question, because one, we really don't know how much they took, what they took, and where it is. We have no idea about any of those things. So
Yeah.
the idea of having this independent person with all his resources, not necessarily relying on the parties, while sometimes it sounds good, it can be used simply for their own power and enrichment. And in this particular case that we've just gone through, even though Musk is no longer around in the sense of being Trump's right-hand man, if you will, on some of this. His little army did go in and scoop up a whole lot of data, and we have no idea what's going on with any of that.
Yeah, I have to say, Tim, when the whole Doge thing happened, and I did not have Elon Musk in mind as the president, future president. I thought it would be somebody less known, less public, maybe a
Mhm.
Peter Thiel kind of figure, or maybe somebody who's really mostly off the radar, a vice
Yeah.
president, something like that. We have a lot of emerging AI firms coming up, which would have fit more seamlessly with the book's narrative. So when Elon Musk was granted all these powers, my first thought was like, knock it off, you're off script. This isn't supposed to happen until 2028. Because he sort of did a lot of the things that the president in my novel does
Yeah.
to take over the government, right?
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, taking data is a big part of that. And the book is very heavy on using your personal data to feed you the information that you need to keep you in line
Hmm.
and to create sort of the illusion of choice and the illusion of democracy in the
Yeah.
early stages, right?
Yeah.
So that's all part of the narrative. And I'm like, Elon, buddy, you're going way ahead of script here. Um, you're that kind of character is not supposed to happen until 2028. And then I was kind of bummed by that because, the risk you take when you do something that's near future that
Mhm.
starts in 3 years
Yeah.
is you could be wrong. And yeah, I don't know how many years before 1984 George Orwell wrote his book. But of course, it's passed, and
Yeah.
it didn't happen as he envisioned. Thankfully, good.
Right.
And so I got a little bummed about that. And then, the split happened with him and President Trump, and he announced the America Party. Thoughts about launching a third party and funding it and funding candidates and possibly including himself. And I was like, hey, mate, wait a minute, maybe this is just a wrinkle in the story and we get
Yeah.
back to it in 2028. So yeah.
The little, yeah, it does conjure up a lot of images and all these crazy things that you think won't happen that do happen. And as you say, maybe the timelines accelerated a little bit from your book. So there's just a lot here to try and unravel, unwind, and talk about. And so maybe I don't know, where does this piece from the book that you wanted to take a look at fit? Is it here? Is it later? Uh,
I was going to bring it up a little later because I thought we might have some fun going over the speeches that were made.
yeah, sure.
But I'm happy to jump to it since we're sort of discussing it. It might make more sense to just hop into that piece.
Okay. I'll give you a moment. And
Okay.
yeah, you've got it.
So
Yeah.
maybe, Tim, it makes sense to, if we're already talking about the heavy stuff, we'll just get into the heavy stuff.
Okay.
And I'll read this excerpt, which is from the Network Apostate, which is the prequel of the
Yeah.
Sins of the Savior series. And this is a journal entry from the main character from June 24th. Um, and I'll just go ahead and read it. And then I thought maybe we could compare that with things the president said during his speech to military leaders a couple days ago.
Okay.
All right. So this is from the journal. After a day of frantic, unconfirmed reports about existential threats, President Wolf addressed the country. I was in a car. Like everyone else, I pulled over to listen. I'd barely parked when he started, "My fellow Americans." The familiar refrain instantly put me at ease. I waited for a calm assessment of what was real and what was rumor, a reassurance of our strength and resolve, a call for unity. But it was a perfunctory introduction, and calm was not his intent. Following a long, dramatic pause, looking down at his desk, President Wolf stared back at us through the camera. "We've been through a lot the last 24 hours. It's worse than you think. You're afraid. You should be." His voice gradually rose to a crescendo. "I'm not just talking about foreign enemies. The media, big tech, and Congress are providing aid and comfort to those enemies. They have become the enemy of the people. Countless American lives have been lost because they failed to keep us safe. So I'm demanding Congress give me the power to do what they cannot, to save our democracy. I can fix it. They know it, you know it, and the American people have had enough. We will not take any more." President Wolf continued to sound the alarm and preemptively characterize any attempt to stand in his way, even the very concept of opposition in this time of national emergency, as treason. He outlined a with or against us path to victory that had no patience for nuance, meddling institutions, or partisan politics. If we didn't commit ourselves fully to his vision, we would never rid ourselves of the enemy within, hiding in plain sight, one that was far more dangerous than any external threat. With only vague whispers of plans to combat the foreign and domestic threat, Wolf outlined a simple recipe to save the country: give him absolute power. The irony that Wolf's War Powers Act would dismantle our democracy to save it was lost on a public eager to reclaim its sense of security. Many of us saw the act for the power play it was, but precious few spoke against it. No one wanted to be branded a traitor in wartime, but more importantly, we were all scared shitless. So that's the piece, and there's the middle of that prequel is really about the mechanics, how the Supreme Court is used and changed, and how Congress is made to heal. The big difference, of course, is he's not partisan. He's an
Mhm.
independent, right? So he has to ensure that um, both parties buckle under him, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And they do um, without too much resistance.
right.
So that's the premise of the book. And then I thought it might be interesting to look over some of the quotes because that enemy from within part,
Yeah.
right? This is something that you hear in the rhetoric of many aspiring authoritarians, as they build momentum. Um, and I have to say, I read over both Pete Hegseth's and the president's speech a couple days ago to the military, and it does appear that he is creating some space, if you will, to have a monopoly of power in the country and to not just stifle defense, but to go after people that are opposed to his agenda, whatever that might be. So I was a little, I don't know. I want to pause there for a
Yeah.
second, Tim? Do you have any thoughts on
No, I
on
mean
the passage?
it's well when I read the passage, I'm reading it, and you can have the name Wolf there, but you could easily replace that name with the current president. And the other thing that got me was this whole idea of the pressure. I mean, I'm thinking about what's been going on with the threats to universities, what's going on with threats to law firms. I mean, just you name it, and that whole reality, that is real life. I mean, that's taking what you had in your book as you wrote it, and you thought of something several years away. Is really happening, right? Where you've got one party that is pretty much every member in Congress of the GOP has stepped aside and said, do whatever you want, because you rarely, if ever, hear anybody, at least publicly challenging, and I doubt that they're doing it privately either. I mean, at the end of the day, they have decided to kowtow and say, we are, even though we were elected, we're not going to act like elected officials representing the population that elected us, right? Whether they be a senator or a member of the House of Representatives. So there is no pushback from that one party. It's as if there are no laws, there's no constitution. I mean, there is no oath to the office to protect and defend the Constitution, and that's pretty much in your character. Same thing's happening, and it's really what I see daily is that's what's happening in real life. There's no
Yeah, I'm
responsibility.
yeah. So that that is this part of taking over the narrative, taking over not just the messages, but the choices you're given. I have to say, like, I'm trying to finish book two, and it's a little depressing because there are all these parallels and overlaps, but I'm trying to get there. And then I did want to say, I've listened to a lot of punditry on that speech, in the enemy within parts, and I wanted to read it in context. So I read the entire speech. And I was a little, I don't know, reassured is maybe too much of a stretch there. But and with your permission, I'll read from
Yeah,
some quotes from the speech, and we'll just skip
sure.
to the president's speech.
Yeah.
But he starts early on talking about the need for borders, for an honest press, for fair elections. And I thought the fair elections part was an odd thing to say. I know his mind kind of is stream of consciousness and he wanders around, but I thought it was setting the stage early in the speech for what he wants the military to know as part of their job, right? Um, so I don't want to read too much into that, but I do want to, point out that a lot of the fears of monopolizing power is that you go from combating a generalized crime in cities to hanging out at polling stations, right? For elections. And I don't think that's a huge jump.
No.
Maybe we create a narrative where Tren de Agua is hanging out at polling booths, and we need to counter that with our guys, and put them in this really uncomfortable situation, which I think the military is in right now.
Yeah.
Where, so a few things sort of stood out to me. So he talks about America under invasion from within. We're under invasion from within. No different than a foreign army, but more difficult in many ways because they don't wear uniforms. At least when they're wearing a uniform, you can take them out. Um, people can read the speech for themselves. This piece comes when he's talking about criminals and crime and illegal immigrants, right? So that's in some kind of context. And I don't, always know whether he does this intentionally. But he skips around, right?
Yeah.
So he's talking about the danger of crime, and then he's talking about the danger of the Democrats, and then he's talking about, the threat to elections and all this other stuff. And it's one of those speaking styles, and it reminds me of how Hugo Chavez actually used to talk, because he would always use phrases like, people say that the US is trying to sabotage this or that, or there's a machine that caused the Haiti earthquake. And because he prefaced this with this unverifiable people say stuff, he was not held to account for the statement, right? He just creates the impression and lets it
Right.
fester. And I saw, a lot of examples of that in this speech and others. And politicians all do this, but he is really at a different level with it. So, this is all in the context. This is all in the same area of the speech where he talks about crime and illegal migration. And then he skips, I think, in the same paragraph. Yeah, just one paragraph down, he talks about radical left lunatics, right? Um, and then a little further on, he wants to thank the Guard in National DC because DC was the most unsafe, most dangerous city in the United States of America. That's just factually incorrect.
Yes.
I mean, generalized crime, I think they're 11th.
Yeah.
And if you look at states' crimes rates and you take it out of the context of large cities, then you see actually higher rates, particularly in the South, right? But
Right.
that's not what he wants to emphasize. That's not the
Correct.
reality he wants to present. Um, Democrats run those cities, they're unsafe places. We're going to straighten them out one by one. And this is going to be a major part for some of the people in this room. That's a war. It's a war from within. A little later on, he says, we can't let these people live. I don't know what people he's talking about at that point, because he's, again, mixing up generalized crime with illegal
Yeah.
migration, with Democrats, with radical left lunatics, with the mayors of these cities. And I don't know if that's by design or not,
Yeah.
but it certainly gives fodder for people who want to make those connections.
Hmm.
You talk about
Sure.
fomenting, the tenor of the discourse. That is,
I
people
mean,
will pick out of this speech what they want,
right.
and if
And
they are looking for a call to action, it's
that's right.
there,
Yeah.
um,
I-
intended or not. So, use of these cities as a training grounds for our national military. We're going into Chicago very soon, and then he drops that. And then he talks about the executive order for providing training for a quick reaction force that can help quell civil disturbances. This is going to be a big thing for the people in this room because it's the enemy from within, and we have to handle it before it gets out of control. Again, there's a lot of like language about it and they, that you can kind of insert whatever entity or person you want into that
Yeah.
space. And he talks about historical precedent, which we can talk about. It's apples and oranges, really. And then keep domestic order and peace. Um, And then he says this part about how the people on the street, everyone loves the military in DC. He's never seen anyone say they don't unless it's a radical and paid off, because a lot of these insurrections are paid by, whether it's Soros or other people, but they're paid off by the radical left. So, I mean, I would just point out to people that don't live in DC that the polling is about 80% of people who don't want the National Guard there.
Well, I was,
So,
as you're reading all these, these things, there's so many things that just come flying into my mind. And it's almost hard to keep track of all the things that you would want to say. For example, when let's talk, yes, the border, there should be some integrity about protecting the border. But the problem I look at is you have a Congress that for the last 50, 60 years has been unable, when it's their job to do something as far as legislation and laws, to actually do something about it. And then during the Biden administration, when they thought they were going to have something, he sabotaged it by threatening the Republicans who actually were for whatever they agreed to. So, again, we look at the guys that are elected to be members of the House and Senate, and they basically wash their hands of this issue because, gee, it's difficult. Yes, it's difficult. That's what your job is to resolve difficult issues and problems. And then it's taken decades for the U.S. military to come back to having the level of respect it has from the American people after Vietnam. I mean, I'll be the first person to say, for the first 25 to 30 years after I got out of the Army, I really did not talk about having been in the Army. And it's all because of so much negativity toward people who served during that period of time. And we just, in my mind, recently got to a point where the country actually has some respect for those who serve. And now what he's going to do by putting members of active duty units into the streets of our cities, all it will do is take us backward, because it isn't their job to police. And we think about the back and forth. Well, it wasn't back and forth. What happened when we did put the military into the streets to quell demonstrations against the Vietnam War? That didn't help either. And basically, that kind of a scenario is what I'm seeing him talking about. And you just go backward. You don't go forward. Not with this kind of idea that, oh, we've got to use the military against our people. Now, in some ways, he has put a different kind of a light on this whole process by saying, well, now that the government shut down, I will withhold funds to blue states. I mean, it's almost as if it's an informal Civil War declaration, if you will, because, oh, those are the states I don't like. They didn't vote for me, so I'm going to keep the money away from them. It's almost that kind of simple thinking that goes on. He does not talk in terms of being president of the United States. He talks in ways that you think he's only president of the red states, right? Because by clearly coming out making a statement that he would withhold funds from blue states I mean, what's that going to make people think? He's not acting as president of the United States. And it goes to the point, that we were talking about earlier about the rhetoric. I mean, the enemy within, does that mean he truly does seem to characterize everybody in a blue state as being his enemy, or in blue cities?
yeah, I think, Tim, the goalposts are sliding and they'll go as far as we'll allow them to go, right? Because you remember originally it was about the worst of the worst. It was about going after illegal migrants with criminal records, with violent criminal records. And now you find out that it's somewhere between 70 and 80% of people that have no criminal record other than crossing the border, right?
Right.
Which is a crime, in fact. And
Sure.
then, so I think it's a bait and switch. And I think, a lot of the things that you talk about, campaign promises made, campaign promises kept, He didn't really have a platform, which worked very, very good during the debates and during, because if all you have is a big brain and that you're going to solve all these problems, and I'm not going to explain to you how, and I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to lay out a platform, which is what a party typically does, then no one can criticize it because it doesn't exist,
Right.
right? And then you've got, Kamala Harris, who actually tries to bring things to the table that then can be criticized, right?
Yeah.
So it kind of puts people at an inherent disadvantage. And then there actually was, I would argue, a platform and a policy book, and it was the Heritage Foundation, right?
Hmm.
And it was the Project 2025, which Trump said he never read, and I believe that. I'm not a big reader, but that is in fact that has become sort of the policy space. That has become the playbook, and I don't blame the Heritage Center for doing that. They probably saw a big space there where there was no policy, and they filled it with what they wanted it to be.
Yeah.
So that's I'm not gonna pound them too hard for filling a vacuum that should have never been there in the first place, right?
Yeah.
So we have a lot to unpack, about what you just said. So I think I'm gonna table it for now and go to Pete Hegseth's remarks
Yeah.
on this. Now, I honestly thought when this whole meeting was announced that I had just read a headline about how a Russian fighter jet had incurred upon airspace in the Arctic somewhere. This
Hmm.
was, days or maybe a week after we had had drone flights over Poland and Estonia. And the president had signaled a change in his policy toward Ukraine, right? A rather sea change kind
Yeah.
of change. And I assumed that it had to do with that, or maybe with Taiwan and China or some other existential threat. Um, but no, it was more about, physical fitness standards and grooming. Um,
Oh, by the way, are you allowed to keep your beard?
Well, for now, but again, the goalpost keeps moving,
Yeah.
right? So just like we went from violent criminal immigrants, which, I mean, why did they give up on that? And I'm not saying they're not still doing investigations, but that was not getting in their quota, right?
Right.
There's only
Right.
so many of those cats they can go after.
Yeah.
Those are long investigations. They take resources,
Yeah.
and Miller and others in the administration wanted raw numbers. So that's where you start going after Home Depots and 7-Elevens and all this other stuff. People that, have paid sales and Social Security tax without getting any benefit for it over years. That's a whole
Right.
separate discussion. But this is where you get people, going into people's houses in the middle of the night, um, or just pulling people over. I'll get back to that a little later, but um, I thought it was interesting that very early on in the speech, he actually Hegseth, I'm talking about, actually addresses what the speech is and isn't about. Likewise, the nature of the threats we face in our hemisphere and in deterring China in it is another speech for another day coming soon. This speech is about people and it's about culture. And, fair enough, that's what it's about. I would argue that there's not a thing that he announced, and some of it I agree with, frankly. I got to tell you, this thing about not making military people do these hours and hours and hours of cyber courses went over very well because, but this is the low-hanging fruit, right?
Yeah.
The military, that does not keep me awake at night. That's not how we're going to be unable to stand up to our adversaries. There was just an
Right.
article about how there is no China strategy, really. So I would kind of rather have that than getting rid of the Beardos. I don't think the Beardos are like an existential threat to our national security. And actually a lot of that stuff I kind of agreed with. But again, you're going to pull in all your leadership
Yeah.
to lecture them about push-ups. My goodness. So, he did not have as much to say about the enemy from within. He saved a little bit for the end where he talks about when he gets over all the political correctness stuff, which I think a lot of that is already in effect.
Yeah,
The DEI stuff has already been canceled and ripped out. So, it's hard to wrap my head around how you would, even just from a taxpayer point of view, fly all these people, every
that's
every general,
unbelievable.
from the one level to the four
Yeah.
level and admirals. Okay,
Well, and
so
not only that, they brought their own senior NCOs, the sergeant majors, with them. A lot of them, I noticed that
yeah.
in the audience. So what they did was they said, well, if this guy's a division sergeant major, I mean, yeah, you're going to bring him along because he's another leader guy that you got to have.
So I'm having a Doge flashback where what we were sold was efficiency, fraud, and abuse. And the reality is not those
No,
things. It's about
no,
control, right?
yes,
And you
yeah,
can talk about culture, but it's about control. It's like when
yeah,
President Trump said, well, if you don't agree, you can leave. No
yeah,
one's leaving. And then makes this comment about, but if you leave, of course, your career's over and you lose everything.
yeah,
And I think there was a little like nervous laughter in there, but this is what dictators do.
yeah.
They call you out in public and try to get you to, um, you know, self-identify yourself and get rid of you. So, deliver justice on behalf of the American people in close and brutal contact if necessary. In this profession, you feel comfortable inside the violence so that our citizens can live peacefully. So throughout this whole speech, Tim, he's talking about the warrior ethos and how we need to be tougher and manlier and meaner. And then early in the speech, he talks about how it's not your job to do all this politically correct stuff. It's your job to kill people and break things, right? Okay, honestly, I'm a little sympathetic to some of that. I do think some of this
Well,
was a distraction over the last few years and
yeah,
overemphasized. But on the flip side of that, you have a guy who's talking about how we need to break things and kill people, but we need to deploy these people to our cities, so that they can do what they're trained to do, which is break things and kill people. You made this point earlier, it's the police and the military have separate audiences for a reason, right? They're not trained to do
no,
civil policing in cities. That's just
no,
not what they do. It's an uncomfortable fit.
yep, yep,
Is it in extremis? Is it allowable? Yeah, sure. But that would be, like civil unrest, like
right.
a large scale demonstration, like January 6th, for example, right?
And I
Or
can
a
tell you,
natural emergency. That's their job. So he's changing their job. And I think this speech is all about how I'm changing your job. And I hope you're good with that. And if you're not, you should leave. Um, and what I found also interesting, especially in Hegseth's speech, is he mentions the Constitution several times. He mentions lawful orders several times. So that gave me a little glimmer of hope, that while they're asking people to do kind of loyalty oaths to the administration, they're maintaining at least the facade of an allegiance to the Constitution, the rule of law, the things that you actually do pledge an oath to when you enter the military or when you enter the Foreign Service, right?
I think you hit the nail on the head. It's a facade. It's simply lip service, but not reality. Because if there was any reality to it, any concreteness to it, you wouldn't have a commander in chief who almost daily violates the oath because he does not believe in the rule of law. And that's pretty obvious to me as a lawyer. When I look at and then when you look at all the times the courts, when a case has gone to court, has found this administration, whether it's through the various cabinet members and the way they conduct their jobs, violating the Constitution and the rules of rule of law. They don't care about the rule of law and they don't care about the Constitution, and that's why the courts have had to go. Basically, I've read a number of these decisions. Oftentimes judges have a lot on their plate as far as cases, but so many of these judges have gone out of their way to write opinions that are much longer than the norm to make it very clear what it is that's been done that is in violation of the law or the Constitution. It is amazing how long sometimes these decisions have been. It's like taking these lawyers who represent the U.S. government to task and reminding them why they went to law school and how to read a law. It is mind-boggling sometimes what goes on in some of these cases. And by the way, the other day, the free speech case out of Boston, that decision was 160 pages long. I mean, it was, and the judge just took the government lawyers to task, and basically, when he looked at the testimony of government officials, it really is basically telling them that they have absolutely either they have literally no idea or they do not care about the rule of law. And it's being done to placate one guy. And that one guy sits in the Oval Office. And he doesn't, I mean, it's all lip service to me.
Yeah, maybe I'm not quite as dark as you are yet, but I did. It's a nice segue to another thing he said in the speech, Tim, which is he's talking, trying to rally the troops, so to speak, and he says to serve something greater than yourself, to fight for God and country, for freedom and the Constitution. And then I have to think to myself, are you aware of the administration in which you serve? I mean. Article 1, Section 2, how electors, 2, 3, and 4 deal with how states are in charge of electors, and it's not the federal government to ask for votes or to ask for changes to gerrymandering, particularly off cycle. That's in the
Yeah.
Constitution every 10 years, which is when we do our
Census.
census, right? So there's that. There's Article 1, Section 9, the Emoluments Clause, not supposed to accept presents from foreign powers unless it's a really good deal, I guess.
Yeah.
Um,
Like jets.
like jets, like anonymous investments in crypto,
Yeah.
So, and then there's Article 10, which is, doesn't specifically say tariffs, but it puts the power of leveraging tariffs with Congress.
Yes.
There's the amendments, let's go through the Bill of Rights. There's the First Amendment, which has been spoken about, ad nauseum, so I won't go into it. There's the Fourth Amendment, unreasonable seats and seizure. There you go. And there's sort of this replacement of probable cause with reasonable suspicion, which is a little suspicious, to say the least. And, Article 5, due process, Article 10, powers not delegated go to the states.
Right.
So that's the one that really, I think, is so at odds with where the Republican Party has been historically, right? And how they can, meddle in gerrymandering in Texas and, and meddle in education in states is, and keep a straight face that they're there to defend the Constitution is a little beyond me. And I'm not asking, when asked about this, Trump sort of does the defer to my lawyers are looking into it and it's really complicated. I don't know that it's that complicated. Constitution is not a very long document. I would
No.
just encourage people to read it for themselves
Yeah.
and see what they
But
think it means.
what I always say when I read some or hear some of these things, I go, I don't see any footnotes in some of these provisions where there's a qualifier down at the bottom of the page. So that's just my way of saying, look, it says what it says. There's no qualification, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. There are no footnotes to any of those clauses. So
Well, and you had mentioned the problem with this whole approach is if Congress is a rubber stamp for the executive, then it's up to the judiciary to push back, right? But they can only push back retroactively.
right,
It's not like the administration is pinging judicial opinion about whether this or that thing is constitutional or
correct.
legal. They just go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
And now you're going to have an incredible backlog. The other point I wanted to make is how many of these justices are Republican appointees and even Trump appointees in some cases, right?
Well, yeah, and there have been a few that are Trump appointees, and there have been a lot that are Reagan appointees or Bush appointees. I mean, I believe the case I was just mentioning about the freedom of speech, I think that was a Reagan appointee. So it's not that the just judges are deciding based upon their political, leanings at all. They're looking at the law and they're looking at the Constitution, and I'd say 98, 99% of these judges are acting in very good faith and being good, lawyers, judges, looking at what they're supposed to look at.
And I'm not a big fan of where the nomination process has gone in the last 10 years with the Supreme Court. I did think it got a little over the top, especially with the Kavanaugh thing. I did not need to know every detail about his college escapades, right? But on the same side, this was started a long time ago when Obama could have appointed someone, and they said, no, we're not doing that,
Yeah.
right? So that's, we started going down that road, and now we have, what people would, you know, a very people might call it a politicized court if you're on one side, or you might call it the right court if you're on the other side, I suppose. But I do think, these people, as you mentioned, they're lawyers. They have a background. It's not like this person they appointed to the Eastern District in Virginia to go after James Comey because the Republican appointed guy wouldn't go along with
Right.
with what looks like to be a very frivolous accusation. So they can replace those people. They can't replace the people that are on the court. And I'm not going to say I'm a fan of some of these people, particularly Justice Thomas, but they're there, right? He
Yeah.
has to deal with them. They're appointed for life. And I think, you would know more about this than I do. I feel like the administration is kind of a split record, victories and defeats so far. But I do think there's going to be a time where, a plain reading of the Constitution is going to require them to fall out of his good graces. And then in my book, the answer to that is to just expand the court and pack it, which is what I've seen happen in Venezuela with the
Yeah.
electoral court, right? Because, these liberal justices and the liberal justice of today might be, the Kavanaugh of tomorrow, because he just can't ignore the law, right?
Yeah.
In good conscience, and the political pressure that you can put on these people is limited by the fact that they're appointed for life. What do you think?
Well, I will certainly go along with, I certainly think it's a politicized court, no doubt, in my mind anyway. I would have, I keep thinking if you have a job now for life, you don't owe anybody anything. You don't have to lie about this or that anymore. Like to me, every nominee that gets up there, there's an element of deceit when they answer the questions before the Senate to get confirmed, right? And it doesn't matter who puts their name up, whether Republican, Democrat, they want to get on the court. And so they kind of, they'll duck and slide this way or that way to avoid answering the question. So it gets to the point where, but once you're on the court, you're no longer beholden to anybody other than the law and the Constitution. Do the job. And I'm not so sure right now how I feel about that. I mean, there was something just a couple days ago about the way the Supreme Court's been going, and I think it said something about, well, right now it's about 21 out of 23 cases they ruled in favor of Trump on various questions. But there are some harder, very, very difficult questions that'll be coming up soon. And as you said about these cases are retrospective, right? Somebody has to file a suit before it actually gets before a judge for a decision. And so when I see things about, oh, the lower court judges, whether it's Court of Appeals or federal district, oh, they're somehow putting obstacles in the way of Trump. Well, no, somebody's filed a lawsuit and asked the courts to take a look at what's going on. I mean, at the end of the day, you've gone to language school, you speak a foreign language. Do you really want to be detained because you are heard by ICE for speaking a foreign language? It doesn't have to be Spanish. It could be anything else that they don't understand. Maybe it's a strong accent from a region of the United States for all I know, because I've been in parts of the United States where I didn't understand some of the strong accents here. But the end of the day, if we're going to say that ICE can detain people simply because, oh, they heard somebody speaking a foreign language, that should be a problem for, I mean, you'd think for anybody, but it isn't. But that just is not probable cause to detain anybody or stop anybody on the streets of the United States.
You know,
Um,
I talked about the changing goalposts earlier,
yeah,
right? So you went from violent criminal immigrants, undocumented, to anyone that crosses the border, right? And then there's all this talk about doing it the right way and the legal way. And I have to say, during the debate, when they talked about eating the dogs and eating the cats, um, and you go back, and those people are all TSP recipients, so they're all on legal status,
yeah,
right? And they help save that community economically, which is a whole nother side story. But I had to scratch my head, and I was like, they made a mistake. Now I realize that they didn't make a mistake. What they meant was illegal and people we think should be illegal,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So they'll
yeah,
rip the status away from people that are in processes, TSP, refugee, parole, you name it, maybe in not yet, but maybe in the future, special immigrant visas, which are for the folks that fought with us in Vietnam, sorry, in Iraq and
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan. You know, so the goalposts are moving, and it's on the record. He's made comments about how he would consider sending Americans to El Salvador camps
Yeah,
if they were bad enough. And uh, um, I've heard various folks talk about, how challenge people's Americanness, right? Um, Tim, the chief of staff, the assistant chief of staff, who's
okay.
made all the he was really driving the ICE policy.
Are you talking about Miller?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah. So, it wasn't enough for him to go after the violent criminals. So he wanted numbers, he wanted quotas, he wants to get 1 million people out. Right. So they're rolling back the goalposts now. And then last night, I just heard a story this morning about they decided to quadrant off an apartment building and just take everyone out of the building, looking for gang members in Chicago. So they wake these kids up in the middle of the night, some of them young. They do the zip tie thing. They march them outside, in whatever they happen to be in when they go to bed. And then they separate them from the adults and they try to figure out who's legal and who's not. I maybe there's a warrant in that, but that seems a little suspicious. So, people that are like, this can't happen to me, need to take a look at all the Americans that have been mistakenly pulled into this. There's
yeah,
the guy who was just showing up for work in California. There's the list is getting longer and longer. And, this precedes the Trump administration. ICE has made erroneous arrests in the past. They have kind of a
sure.
reputation for that. You magnify it by the need to have quotas filled and to ask nothing of people or virtually nothing of people for qualifications, any age, come on by, we'll sign you up. The South Park stuff is more on target than it probably intended to be. But so that's where we're at. And the people that say, well, it's about those people, I think should keep that in mind
Well, I
because
would agree.
the goalposts are sliding.
Yeah,
And if Stephen Miller's in charge, he's going to be reviewing your Facebook posts and making sure that you're a good American.
yeah.
Citizenship may, you know, we
Uh,
assume citizenship makes us safe. I wouldn't assume that.
no,
You know,
and I would also I would say too that the definition of who's a good American is his definition, not anybody else's.
that's right.
And
Yeah.
so that's another thing to keep in mind. And it makes me think about, I don't know, a few weeks ago, and Hope will remember that I wrote a blog piece about looking American. And if you don't look American, you don't look American, you don't sound American, you don't whatever. I mean, as you say, the goalposts keep moving, and it seems to be getting narrower and narrower because it is moving. Uh,
Yep.
and
And
yeah.
reasonable suspicion, that's pretty subjective.
Oh yeah, sure.
I have friends who are darker complected, that go to really, live in a really nice neighborhood, send their kid to a really nice school, but are afraid for that kid to walk to school now because of the reasonable suspicion part, right?
Mm,
And then, yeah, they can let you go, but they've traumatized you and your kids in the in the heat of this. So
yeah,
I think it puts ICE agents in a horrible position, and not to mention the National Guard guys.
yeah,
I try to imagine, myself being sent to be basically eye candy in front of national monuments in DC for a photo op kind of
right.
thing. So, yeah, I mean, what really disturbs me is in my book, it requires an act of war to get people to buy into all this stuff, right? It's the
Yeah.
rally around the flag, we're being attacked, common enemy thing.
Yes.
If I feel like I may have given ourselves too much credit because it seems like we don't need that. Even this sort of generalized crime, which is going down in the cities he's targeting, actually, is enough. It
Yeah.
just
And
it does blow me away.
I guess when I think about what you're saying, in many countries, yes, it might take a war. I think the difference in the United States, and this is maybe is again just me looking at the world in this country, because we have so many ethnicities in this country. It's easy to divide those, the American people up with, one ethnic group versus another because we have so many, more than many countries. We have various shades in this country. And, we have so many different religions in this country. And I think in some ways they play on all of that and use that as a nice tool. I mean, it's an easy way to divide. And they've done a wonderful job of doing that.
Well, yeah, if you look at the ICE website, it's all these trendy Aragua guys who are like, I don't know, 0.0005% of the people they're hauling in. So anyone who speaks back is, automatically
Yeah.
aligned with crime and terrorism and whatever. And it seems to be to a large degree working, unfortunately. So I wanted to tap into your background a little bit. So you were in the
Okay.
military 72, 75.
Yeah.
I don't remember when Kent State happened, but
That was 1970. I was
yeah.
in high school, and actually I was living at Fort Knox, Kentucky. It was my father's last army posting before he retired when that happened. And then I did actually, being from Ohio, my father being from Ohio, I actually got my bachelor's degree at Kent State.
Hmm.
So I
Oh,
used the GI
wow.
Bill for that. But
I
that was
did not
years ago.
know about that personal connection.
Yeah. So
Um,
yeah. So it's yeah, it's interesting looking back at that point in time, uh, being, living on an army post, growing up that way, uh, and I guess the '60s were an interesting time for many of us, and I will say that, up until 64, 65, I was the typical army brat, super flag waving, blah blah blah, do all that. Two combat tours in Vietnam for my father kind of changed me a bit. And I didn't see it all that way by the time I went in the Army in 72. And I'll be the first one to admit that the biggest motivator for going into the Army in 72 was, well, I'm the oldest of five kids. We don't have that much money for me to go to college. I went in the Army because I wanted the GI Bill to get my education. Um, you know, Vietnam soured me on lots of things like it did for many other people. But for me, the goal was get out and get the GI Bill, get my education. My thought processes from 1964, 65 were different by the time I got to 70, 72, 73.
well, since you were around back then, I want to test an assumption I have. I've heard about all these cases. There's a famous one, I think it's from Spokane, where there was a protest in front of an ICE facility, and they arrested a few people, spent the night in jail, out the next day. Weeks later, the FBI comes back and charges them with conspiracy. Right. So my feeling, Tim, is back in Vietnam where, passions ran high and people had opinions, that You could do the protest thing. You might spend the night in jail. That's how they push back.
Yeah.
You want to get in, you want to obstruct or whatever, you get to spend the night in jail. But we're not gonna gin up, Trump up, accusations of conspiracy, that could be, a year in prison kind of thing because you stood in the driveway
Yeah.
of the ICE
No.
facility. And this guy was a veteran, right?
Yeah.
Combat veteran,
Yeah.
spotless record. And then, I go through the comments of this thing, and it was like, well, where he screwed up is he shouldn't have obstructed the vehicle. And I'm like, yeah, technically okay, but come on.
Yeah.
I mean, am I wrong that back in the day you would spend the night in jail, but the
I don't.
FBI would not use its limited time and resources
No.
to concoct a conspiracy charge?
They they if they did, it would have been isolated cases. It wouldn't be like what we're seeing today. Part of it's also, I mean, if you look at the if you look at the absolute numbers of people in the streets and demonstrating during that period of time against the Vietnam War, that would have been ridiculously impossible. I mean, the kind of demonstrations we had against the war, we're talking about tens of thousands of people in a city or college towns and so on. I mean, and then, if you think about, again, going back to what we're talking about a bit, putting the military in the streets or whatever, look at the debacle at Kent. And when you do put uniformed people, not police, not properly trained, face to face with demonstrators, things can go wrong very quickly.
Yeah, and Tim, the one thing that really annoys me about the public messaging from this in the White House is that if you're against deploying National Guard, um, against the wishes of governors, again, look at the Constitution, look at the law, look at the Posse Comitatus Act. If you're against those things, then you're automatically with the criminals and against the troops. And nothing could be further from the truth. I really feel for these guys,
Yeah,
that are being pulled out. I guess in this case, they're not even being paid anymore
right.
because of the shutdown. Go pick up some trash,
Yeah,
luck nice. They don't have arrest authority, right?
right.
So physical presence, could do something.
Sure.
And then someone did a comparison, like just the first month of what we're paying. I mean, there's a cost, right? That for these guys could house the entire homeless community of DC for a year.
Yeah,
Maybe, maybe not. But I mean, the other question I have is if it's really about crime, then why don't you pay for the extra 200 to 400 police officers that DC says they need,
yeah,
right? Trained professionals that go after criminals and,
right.
and keep the streets safe and know how to deal with civilians, right? Why don't you do that? And then, of course, it's like, oh, that'll take time. We need to do it right away. I'm like, well, you stood up ICE rather quickly.
Yeah,
That wasn't a problem. So where there's a will, there's a way.
sure.
If it was about crime, they'd be bolstering police forces and giving them bonuses,
Right.
and not abusing the National Guard to do things that they were never supposed to do.
So I'm going to ask a question, because if you would like to go out with one big point, what would it be? I know we could probably talk about this stuff all day.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to press you on that if
I,
you don't mind.
I mean, something did just kind of come to mind for me, and that is that people should push back. This is all fiction in my book, right?
Yeah.
And people like Orwell and Huxley and all the kind of, I would say, deeper dystopian people, they're warning people. They're trying to prevent the future that they're envisioning. I'm probably giving myself too much credit to lump myself in with those folks, but that's the point of my book as well, right?
Yeah.
And I think what you've seen with media companies and universities and law firms, and tech giants, actually, this kind of
Yeah.
folding and gentrification, and here's your presence, or
Yeah.
uh, again, Constitution, but never mind that. That all sets an incredibly bad precedent and example for people that are a lot more vulnerable, right?
Right. Right.
So I get people, and I myself, I'm like, wow, should I post this? Uh, you know, maybe I shouldn't post this. And once you start doing that, that's a problem. You know,
Yeah.
that the democracy needs people to speak freely. They need people to speak truth to power. And when you start threatening people implicitly or explicitly, then that's a problem. So maybe one of the things, there's a lot of things in the book that we didn't get to: conversion of global economy and cyber merit-based currency, partisanship, polarization, capitulation of other branches. Well, we did kind of touch on that.
Yeah.
But the one thing that I kind of want to end on is this demonization and criminalization of protest. And if you would entertain me, I would read a passage from the prequel that deals with this.
Okay. Yeah.
So this is again from the perspective of the protagonist's sister who lives through the transition on the home front. I smothered those personal concerns to focus on the protest, the same protest Gloria was trying to publicize for the following morning. It might be our last chance to put the world back in order while it could still be saved. I owed it to Gloria to at least show up. Spread by word of mouth, I was surprised at the large crowd, at least 4,000 brave souls gathered at the Seattle courthouse. I was late enough that I was only at the edge of the group when hundreds of police charged in, arresting those in the periphery as they peeled away layers to get to the protest nucleus. Electrons like me, still swirling ambiguously beyond the demonstration's edge, had a choice to make: move forward toward the protest core and get arrested, or prepare to be bystanders and go home. I chose the latter. I survived. I never heard from my friends in that protest again. That night, it was on the news at a press conference. President Wolf said it was a, quote, reminder of how enemy misinformation can mobilize radicals against their own government. Not one critical question. No one spoke up for this. And we are not there yet. But I would encourage people to speak out and, post that post and,
Yeah.
try to be respectful and try to, you don't convince people by, accusing their motives, right? But try to find the common ground when you can. Try to push back on things that seem ridiculous, illogical, or immoral, and, attend those protests while you still can.
Yeah. Well, I haven't been attending protests. I know Hope knows that I do post a few blogs here and there that hopefully go along that line. So yeah, I haven't been completely self-censoring yet. So, we got to keep plugging along in that vein, as you point out. So, yeah, we have to just keep encouraging it.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate you reading that last passage and encouraging people to really think about what's going on. And it is important to say, look, the country does have a constitution. It is supposed to be a democracy, not an authoritarian state. And we have to think about every day what's going on and how to preserve what we think we should be having here. It's not simply going along just because it's comfortable and easy. It's sometimes doing the thing that's the hard thing to do. And so that's an important aspect of all of this for us. Appreciate you being on and giving us so much of your time. And who knows, maybe we'll have to return to this depending on how things go over the next few months and come back to one of the other themes that you pointed out.
Yeah, Tim, we left some things on the table. I feel like I could talk to you all day about any number of these things. And I really wanted to talk to you about the whole future economy I envision, but maybe for another
Yeah,
podcast another day. Thank you so much for having me.
thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was amazing. That was the conversation I was looking to have. I took copious notes so that we can share this with our audience. So thank you, Joe Relk, author of the Sins of Our Savers series, and of course, our host, Timothy Trainer, an IP attorney and author of the award-winning books, The China Factor and The China Connection. I'm Hope Katz-Gibbs, proud producer of the show on Incandescent Radio and Incandescent TV. We will talk to you next month on Tim's Travails. Thank you all.